Richard Whitfield arrived at his estate on a Wednesday afternoon without telling anyone he was coming. That was not his habit. His habit was to arrive on Friday nights, after the staff had already received their instructions by email, and everything was arranged in the exact order he expected to find it. But the meeting up in Chicago had been cancelled with only 5 hours' notice, and the next available flight back to Connecticut left at 4 in the afternoon. And Richard was not the kind of man who waited around in airports when there was another option. He walked through the front door with his briefcase in hand, and his mind still on a contract he hadn't finished reviewing on the plane, and he stopped, not because of anything he could see, but because of something he didn't expect to feel. The house smelled different. Not the neutral, climate-controlled scent that the ventilation system kept at the exact temperature and air quality his house manager considered optimal. There was something else. Fresh flowers. Not the decorative arrangements that got swapped out every week according to protocol, but flowers someone had placed somewhere nearby because they wanted them there. And something harder to name. Something it took Richard a moment to identify because it had been a long time since he'd found it in that house. Something human. He set the briefcase down in the entryway and walked toward the wing where his mother's room was. Eleanor Whitfield had been living with the diagnosis for 10 months now. Advanced cancer. Richard had paid for the best oncologists in the country, the most comprehensive treatment available, 2 nurses working rotating shifts, and a medical coordinator who managed every aspect of her care. Everything was covered. Everything was handled. Richard reviewed the medical reports every week, wherever he happened to be, and gave instructions by email when it was necessary. He was doing right by her as a son. That's what he told himself when the thought of his mother surfaced in the gaps between the meetings he kept. The door to her room was ajar. He approached without making a sound, not out of any intention to spy, but because his footsteps on the marble hallway floor were quiet, and no one had heard him come in. He looked in. What he saw stopped him completely. His mother was sitting in the chair by the window, eyes closed, her head tilted slightly forward. Kneeling on the floor in front of her was a young woman Richard didn't immediately recognize. Dark hair pulled back, simple work clothes, her hands moving with a gentleness that wasn't the practiced gentleness of someone trained for a procedure, but the gentleness of someone doing something with real care because the person in front of her mattered. The young woman was shaving his mother's head. The last strands of hair that had survived the chemotherapy fell slowly to the floor. Richard looked at the young woman's face. She was crying silently. Not the showy crying of someone who wants to be seen crying, but the quiet crying of someone feeling something she can't and won't contain, but also isn't going to turn into a scene. And his mother, Eleanor, who for months now had worn an expression Richard associated with the resignation of someone who has accepted that pain is her permanent companion, had her eyes closed and a peace on her face he hadn't seen in a long time. She was holding the young woman's wrist with her hand, not the way you hold on to someone so they won't leave, but the way you hold something that needs to know it is being held too. Richard didn't go in. He didn't say anything. He stood in the doorframe for a length of time he didn't measure, looking at something he didn't know how to name, but which produced in the center of his chest a feeling he also couldn't name in that moment. It wasn't tenderness, exactly. It was something more uncomfortable than tenderness. It was the recognition that what he was watching was something he had not given, that everything he had paid for and organized and coordinated from a distance had not produced this. That in that room, with fresh flowers and the smell of tea and the hands of a stranger, his mother had something his contracts had never bought. He backed away quietly, went to his study, sat down behind the desk, and opened his laptop out of reflex, out of the automatic need to do something concrete, when what he was feeling had no concrete shape. But he didn't read anything. He just sat there staring at the screen, seeing instead the image of his mother and the young woman crying, and Eleanor's small hand resting on that wrist, and thinking about when the last time was that he had held his mother's hand. He couldn't remember. That was the problem. He couldn't remember. The next morning, Richard called his house manager, Mrs. Patterson, and asked for the complete staff roster. Patterson brought it in 22 minutes, with the efficiency of someone who anticipated that when the boss asked for something in that particular tone, it was better not to make him wait. She walked him through the names, the shifts, the assigned responsibilities. When she reached Emily Carter, Richard raised his hand. That one. What exactly does she do? General housekeeping, sir. Common areas, the second floor, coordination with the laundry service. When was she hired? 8 months ago. Have her come to my study at 10. Emily arrived on time. She was 28 years old, with the posture of someone who knows she's been called in for something that isn't going to be easy, and who has already decided in advance that it isn't going to make her shrink. Richard looked at her from behind the desk. Sit down. She sat. I saw what you were doing yesterday in my mother's room. Emily didn't answer right away, not out of guilt, not nervously, but with the calm of someone waiting to hear the rest before deciding what to say. You were hired to clean, Richard continued, not to care for my mother, not to take on responsibilities that belong to the medical staff. I understand. Do you? I understand what you're telling me, Emily said. But if you'll allow me, I'd also like to tell you what I saw. Richard didn't respond, which she took as permission. Mrs. Whitfield went 3 nights without anyone changing her sheets after she'd sweated through them from the fever. One of those nights she vomited, and I called the nurse on duty 4 times before she came. Your mother was alone for 40 minutes. She paused briefly. She started losing her hair, and every morning she'd find it on the pillow. Nobody talked to her about it. Nobody asked her how she was doing beyond the medical chart. There are 2 nurses under contract specifically for that. They do their job. They do it well. But medical care and companionship aren't the same thing. Mrs. Whitfield didn't just need someone to monitor her blood pressure. She needed someone to be with her. Richard looked at her. There was something in the way she spoke that wasn't insolence. It was precision. She said exactly what needed to be said, without decoration, without apology, without the defensiveness of someone who knows she's overstepped. That's not your responsibility, Richard said. No. But it was necessary. Before Richard could answer, the study door opened. Eleanor, in a wheelchair, pushed by the nurse on duty, who wore the expression of someone who wished this weren't happening, rolled into the study with the look of a woman who had heard enough from the hallway. Mom, you shouldn't be— Yes, I should, Eleanor said, in that voice that had lost volume to the illness but not authority. Richard, that girl is the only person in this house who has treated me like a human being in the last 10 months. There's an entire medical team. Don't talk to me about the medical team. My body hurts. My hair is falling out. I'm scared at night, and sometimes I just need someone to sit with me. She paused to breathe. Emily sits with me. You send emails. The silence in the study had the particular weight of truths too exact to argue with. If you fire her, Eleanor said, I go too. Richard looked at his mother. He looked at Emily. Emily said nothing. She didn't need to. The situation had already said everything. Nobody's going anywhere, Richard finally said, in the voice of someone who has just lost an argument, knows it, and is choosing not to prolong what's already over. Eleanor nodded, said something to the nurse, and left the study. Emily stood to leave as well. Emily, Richard said. She stopped. What you do for her, keep doing it. It wasn't a thank you, not yet. It was something clumsier and more honest than a thank you. It was the bare minimum acknowledgement of someone who has just understood he's been wrong, but doesn't yet know how to say it any other way. Emily nodded and left. Richard sat alone in the study. He opened his laptop. 49 unread emails. He looked at them for a moment, closed the laptop and went to find his mother. Richard spent that afternoon in his mother's room for the first time in weeks. It wasn't easy. Eleanor was resting when he arrived, and he sat in the chair by the window, not quite sure what to do with his hands or the silence. It was the kind of silence he hadn't had to sit with in a long time, because his entire life was built on the elimination of silence. There was always an email, a call, a document, something to justify not simply being present without a concrete purpose. Here there was none of that, just his mother sleeping, and him sitting there watching her breathe. When Eleanor opened her eyes and saw him there, her expression moved through several things in a single second. Surprise. Something that might have been joy. if it hadn't been so tangled up with something more cautious. "What are you doing here?" she asked. "I came to be with you." "Don't you have meetings?" "I cancelled them." Eleanor studied him with the direct evaluation of a woman who has known her son for 53 years and knows how to tell when he's telling the truth from when he's telling her what he thinks she wants to hear. "Did you cancel them, or did you push them back?" Richard didn't answer right away. "I pushed them back," he admitted. Eleanor let out something that wasn't quite a laugh, but came close. "At least you're honest." They sat in silence for a while, a different silence than before. Not the awkward silence of the beginning, but the silence of two people learning to be in the same room together, neither of them quite sure yet how to do it well. "How long has Emily been here?" Richard asked. 8 months. "When did she start staying with you beyond her regular shift?" Eleanor thought about it. "Since the 2nd month. I had a hard night and she was cleaning the hallway when she heard me. She came in without anyone calling her. She stayed until I fell asleep." "Why didn't you tell me?" Eleanor looked at him. "Richard, when's the last time you called me just to ask how I was doing?" The medical report. How was I supposed to—" "Emily buys flowers with her own money," Eleanor continued. "Did you know that? She doesn't bring them on Mondays. She says the week should start with something alive in the room." She paused. "She reads to me out loud when I can't sleep. Not medical pamphlets, novels, the ones I ask her for." Richard looked at the nightstand. There was a book with a paper bookmark tucked in around page 30-something. Beside it, flowers in a glass jar. Not florist flowers, farmers' market flowers, the kind someone picks because they look pretty, not because they're on the household expense list. "I asked for the records this morning," Richard said. "What records?" "The staff, Emily's hours, the expenses she's logged for the house." Eleanor looked at him. "What for?" "To understand." Eleanor nodded slowly. "And what did you find?" "I haven't gone through all of it yet." He paused. "But Patterson told me there are nights that aren't in the log. Nights Emily stayed without being scheduled because she didn't want anyone to have to ask her. She did it on her own." Richard looked at the book on the nightstand. "What's she reading with you?" Eleanor smiled faintly. "A novel from the 50s, about a woman who loses everything and starts over 3 times. "Do you like it?" "I love it. Emily says the best stories are the ones that prove endings aren't really endings. They're beginnings that don't know it yet." Richard looked at his mother. There was colour in her face that afternoon. Not the colour of health exactly, but the colour of someone who is truly alive, not just functioning. "How are you, Mum?" he asked. "Not the report. You." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "Today I'm good," she said. "You're here, and that helps more than you know." Richard nodded. He didn't say anything else, but he stayed until his mother fell asleep again. And when he walked out of the room toward his study to look over Emily's records, something inside him was shifting, slowly, with the resistance of things that have been in the same position for a long time and don't yet know they need to move. What he found in those records was going to finish the job of moving him. The records told a story nobody had written for him to read. Richard went through them in his study that night with the same attention he gave financial reports, column by column, date by date, hour by hour. Emily Carter, 8 months at the estate. Official shift Monday through Friday, 8 in the morning to 6 in the evening, Saturdays until noon. But the house's security access logs, which the system kept automatically, told a different story. Tuesday, September 3rd. Exit logged at 6:15, return at 11 p.m. No scheduled shift, no logged pay. Thursday the 17th. No exit logged at all. She had slept in the house on a night that wasn't her shift. Monday the 24th, entry at 6 a.m., 2 hours before her official start time. Richard counted the irregular nights, 19 in 8 months. 19 nights Emily had been in that house without anyone asking her to, without any pay on record, for no reason other than that she'd decided to stay. He pulled up the staff expense records. Every employee had a small household expense account. Emily's showed purchases at a neighborhood pharmacy, medications that weren't on the doctor's official list, vitamin supplements, a small humidifier. He called Patterson. The medications Emily bought at the pharmacy, what exactly are they? Patterson took a moment. They're not on the household account, sir. She paid for them out of pocket. The pharmacy confirmed she has a personal account there. She buys something roughly every 2 weeks. Richard hung up. Emily was paying for medications out of her own salary. Nothing expensive, small things. A gentler pain reliever for the nights the prescribed one was too harsh. Ginger tea, after Eleanor mentioned it, helped with the nausea. Mint candies for when the treatment left a bad taste in her mouth. Things that weren't on any medical protocol. Things someone only notices when they're actually present. Richard closed the records, stood up, and walked down the hallway. The house was quiet at that hour. The night staff at their posts, the hallway lights dimmed. He passed his mother's room. The door was ajar, and there was soft light inside. He looked in. Emily was sitting in the chair beside the bed, reading quietly out loud. His mother was asleep. Emily's voice was just quiet enough not to wake her, and just clear enough that if Eleanor opened her eyes in the middle of the night, she'd find sound before she found darkness. Richard stood in the hallway and listened without going in. He didn't catch the words. He caught the tone, the cadence of someone who has read enough to know that words have their own rhythm, and that the rhythm matters as much as the meaning. He went to his room, sat on the edge of the bed, and thought about his mother in her 60s telling him how proud she was of what he'd built. He thought about the last birthday he'd spent with her in person, 5 years ago now, and all the birthdays in between that he'd celebrated with a phone call from some airport somewhere in the world. He thought about what Emily had done in 8 months, without anyone asking her to, and he thought about the 53 years he'd had to do something like it, and hadn't. The next morning he came down early to the kitchen, where Emily was preparing his mother's breakfast. She saw him come in and didn't change anything about what she was doing. She kept cutting the fruit into the exact size Eleanor could chew without discomfort, ever since the treatment had made her mouth sensitive. "I found the records," Richard said. "Which records?" "The nights, the medications." Emily kept cutting. "It's fine," she said. "It's not fine. You're using your own money for expenses in this house. They're small things. It's not about the amount. It's not your responsibility." Emily set the knife down on the cutting board and looked at him directly. "Do you want me to stop?" Richard didn't answer right away. "I want you to give me a full list of what you've spent, so I can pay you back." "That's not necessary." "Yes, it is, Emily. I didn't do it so I'd be paid back." "I know," Richard said. "That's exactly why I'm going to pay you back." Emily looked at him for a moment, then nodded and went back to the breakfast tray. Richard poured himself a cup of coffee and stayed in the kitchen while she finished, not because he needed the coffee, but because for the first time in a long time, he wasn't in a hurry to be somewhere else. Richard cancelled 2 more meetings that week, not pushed them back, cancelled them outright. His assistant emailed him 3 times to confirm he'd understood correctly, and he answered yes each time, with the brevity of someone who doesn't want to leave room for negotiation. He spent his afternoons in his mother's room. The first few days were awkward, the way reunions are awkward between people who love each other but have forgotten how to be together. Richard didn't know what to say. His mother wasn't sure what to expect from him in this new arrangement either. They'd had very defined roles for years. He called, she gave updates. He promised to come soon. She told him not to worry. Now he was there and neither of them had a script. Emily showed up that afternoon with 2 cups of tea and set them on the side table without anyone asking. She looked at the scene, took in the awkward silence with that ability of hers to read a room and said, "Mrs. Whitfield, let me tell you what happened yesterday with the on-call doctor. Tell me." And she launched into a story about a mix-up with the nursing shifts that, in her hands, turned into something genuinely funny. Eleanor laughed. Richard listened, and suddenly the 3 of them were talking without either of them having had to decide it was time to talk. Richard noticed it. Emily hadn't stepped in to fill the silence out of her own discomfort. She'd stepped in because she saw the silence was an obstacle between 2 people who wanted to connect and didn't know how, and she'd given them an opening. That night, after his mother had fallen asleep, Richard found Emily in the kitchen washing the teacups. "How do you do it?" he asked. She looked at him. "Do what?" Know what people need before they ask for it. Emily thought about her answer while she dried a cup. My mother was sick, she said. Not here. In our old house, which was a lot smaller than this. And I learned that when someone's sick, what they need most isn't for you to fix things. It's for someone to look at them. For someone to be in the same room, not needing anything important to happen. Richard looked at her. Did your mother get better? Emily took a moment. No, she said. She died 6 years ago. What from? Lung cancer. Richard felt something he couldn't quite name in that moment, but it had to do with an image coming into focus, an image of Emily that had started forming with the record of the nights and the medications paid for out of pocket, and that now had a context that changed everything. Did she get treatment? Late, Emily said. By the time we got to a doctor, there wasn't much left to do. We didn't have the money for the preventive screenings. She said it without bitterness, with the calm of someone who has had enough time to process something that she can now say without the pain choking the words. If we'd gotten there sooner, maybe it would have been different. Richard looked at the clean cup in her hand. Is that why you take care of my mother the way you do? Emily looked at him directly. I take care of Mrs. Whitfield because Mrs. Whitfield deserves to be taken care of, she said. But yes, I know what it's like to watch your mother get sick and not be able to do anything. And when I can do something, I do it. She went to hang up the cups. Richard stayed in the kitchen after she left. He thought about Emily's mother dying in a small house without the screenings that would have caught the cancer in time. He thought about his own mother in a mansion with 2 nurses and top-tier oncologists, and him, reviewing reports from airports. He thought about the difference between having resources and actually using them for what matters. And he thought about all the people who had neither. He didn't sleep well that night. It wasn't work keeping him up. Mrs. Patterson came in one Monday with an expression Richard recognized, the expression of someone bringing information she considers important, who has calculated that not bringing it would be worse than bringing it. Patterson had run the estate for 14 years with the efficiency of someone who's learned that her job is to solve problems before they reach the boss, and that when they do reach him anyway, it's because they're too big for her to solve alone. There's something I need to tell you, she said. Sit down. Patterson sat with the folder on her knees. This morning, Miss Harrington came by. Richard's expression didn't change. Vanessa Harrington, 36, a businesswoman. They'd been together for 4 years, a relationship that was more convenient than deep, one they'd both sustained with the comfort of people who share the same social circles and have no urgent reason to end something that isn't actively bothering them. What happened? She came by unannounced while you were with Mrs. Whitfield. She spoke with the staff. Patterson paused briefly. She asked about Emily specifically. What did she ask? How long she's been here? What exactly she does? Why she sleeps in the house more than her shift indicates? Richard looked at her. Who gave her that information? No one gave it to her directly. She checked the shift board in the kitchen. She talked to the nurse on duty. Where is she now? In the garden. She said she'd wait for you. Richard found Vanessa on the terrace with a coffee someone had brought her, sitting with the posture of someone who has already decided in advance how she's going to handle a conversation. Why didn't you tell me you were coming? He asked. I wanted to surprise you. And? Vanessa set the coffee down on the table. Richard, who is that girl? Emily Carter, household staff. Household staff doesn't sleep in the house 19 nights without a scheduled shift. My mother needs her. Your mother has 2 nurses. The nurses do their job. Emily does something else. Vanessa looked at him with the cold assessment of someone who is smart and knows that intelligence sometimes finds what it wasn't looking for. What exactly? She keeps her company. She listens to her. She reads to her. She buys her things with her own money. He paused. Things I wasn't doing. Vanessa picked up her bag. Richard, that girl is taking advantage of the situation. An employee who works her way into the family when the boss isn't around, who creates emotional dependency in a sick, vulnerable woman. That has a name. It has several names, Richard said. The one you're giving it and the correct one. And what's the correct one? That she's the only person in this house who's done what should have been done from the start. Vanessa looked at him for a moment. You're defending her. I'm telling the truth, Vanessa. That woman is a household employee. She's not family. She's not a friend. She's someone who collects a paycheck to be here, and who's clearly decided she can occupy spaces that aren't hers to occupy. Richard didn't answer right away. He thought about Emily kneeling on the floor, shaving his mother's head with careful hands and silent tears. He thought about the 19 unpaid nights, the medications bought out of her own pocket, the story of her mother dying of cancer in a small house without the resources that might have changed the outcome. He thought about Vanessa, who had visited the estate 4 times in 10 months and never once spent more than 20 minutes in Eleanor's room. Emily occupies exactly the space that belongs to her, he said, the one nobody else was occupying. Vanessa picked up her bag. When you figure out what actually matters to you, call me. She left without waiting for an answer. Richard stayed on the terrace looking out at the garden. He didn't feel what he expected to feel. No relief, no guilt, none of the things someone is supposed to feel after a conversation like that. He felt clarity, the kind that isn't comfortable but is necessary, the kind that arrives when a person finally stops confusing what's convenient with what's true. He went to his mother's room. Emily was arranging that week's flowers in the glass jar. Eleanor was watching her with that calm expression Richard had learned to recognize as the expression his mother wore when she was exactly where she wanted to be. Richard sat down in the chair. None of the 3 of them spoke about Vanessa. There was no need. The critical night came on a Tuesday without warning. Richard was in his study going over contracts when he heard the sound. He didn't know right away what it was. A thud, then silence, then Emily's voice calling for the nurse with an urgency that wasn't panic, something more controlled, and for that reason more alarming. He reached his mother's room in 20 seconds. Eleanor was on the floor beside the bed. She'd tried to get up on her own in the early hours, and her legs hadn't responded the way she expected. She was struggling to breathe. It wasn't the breathing of someone who had simply fallen. It was the breathing of someone whose lungs were working harder than they should have to. Emily was already on the floor beside her. She hadn't moved her. She'd learned enough over these months to know that moving someone in that condition, without knowing exactly what happened, could make things worse. She was cradling Eleanor's head with one hand, and with the other, dialing the on-call doctor. Richard dropped to his knees on the other side. Mum. Eleanor opened her eyes, looked at him. Something in her gaze was different, more strained, as if keeping her eyes open required more effort than usual. I'm here, Richard said. The nurse arrived, then the on-call doctor, who lived 10 minutes away and got there in 8, because Emily had been clear on the phone about what she was seeing. Over the next hour, Richard didn't leave the room. The doctor stabilized Eleanor, a respiratory crisis related to fluid buildup. Not the first one, he explained, but more severe than the previous episodes. They settled her into bed with supplemental oxygen and adjusted medication. When the doctor and nurse stepped out to prepare additional equipment they'd requested, Richard and Emily were left alone with Eleanor, who was breathing more easily now but sleeping with the exhaustion of someone who has just fought a small battle. Richard stood by the bed, his hands not knowing where to go. Emily sat in the chair, adjusting the room temperature because the doctor had specified it needed to stay within a certain range. Has this happened before? Richard asked, once things felt less urgent. Why wasn't I told? Emily looked at him. It was reported to the medical coordinator. It's in that week's report. Richard thought about the reports he read every week on the plane or between meetings, columns of data, levels, medications, indicators. He'd read that report. He hadn't understood what it meant in real terms. What do I do? He asked. The question came out before he could stop it. It wasn't the kind of question Richard Whitfield asked. It was the question of someone who has just understood, all at once, that being present isn't enough if you don't know what to do with that presence. Emily didn't smile, didn't take advantage of the moment. Sit with her, she said. If she wakes up and you're there, that's enough for now. Richard sat down. Emily turned off the overhead light and left only the small lamp on the nightstand. She brought an extra blanket and draped it over Richard's shoulders without him asking, because the room was cold and he was wearing a work shirt, and nobody had thought of that. Then she sat down in the other chair on the far side of the bed and stayed there. They didn't talk for a long time. The oxygen machine made its soft, steady sound. Eleanor's breathing grew more regular. The clock on the wall read 1, then 2, then 3 in the morning. At some point, Richard realized he was holding his mother's hand. He didn't remember deciding to do it. It had simply happened, with the naturalness of things the body does when the mind finally stops controlling everything. He looked across at Emily. She was awake, watching Eleanor with the quiet attentiveness of someone who has spent many nights like this and learned to inhabit them without being consumed by them. "How did you manage it, when it was your mother?" Richard asked quietly. Emily took a moment. "Badly," she said. "I did it very badly because there was no one to teach me how to do it well." She paused. "But I was present, that much I did. Until the end, I was present." Richard looked at his mother, asleep with the oxygen and the blanket and her small hand between his. "I haven't been present," he said. "No," Emily agreed, without cruelty and without excessive softness either. Just the honesty that was her way of treating people. "But you're here now." 4 in the morning came slowly. Eleanor opened her eyes for a moment. She saw Richard holding her hand, saw Emily in the other chair, and closed her eyes again with an expression that wasn't resignation. It was peace. And Richard, who had spent 53 years learning to measure the value of things in terms of performance and efficiency, understood in that room at 4 in the morning that there were things with no monetary equivalent, and that he had been looking for them in the wrong place his whole life. The days that followed the crisis were different, not overnight, but slowly, with the gradualness of changes that are real, because they don't feel any need to prove themselves. Richard began organizing his schedule differently. He didn't eliminate work, that was neither possible nor necessary, but he learned to set boundaries around it with the same firmness he'd once applied to everything else. Mornings at the estate, afternoons with his mother when he could manage it. No flights at night unless absolutely necessary. His assistant took a full week to stop asking if he was sure every time he cancelled something. Eleanor noticed the change before she said anything about it. One afternoon, Richard came into her room and found Emily reading aloud. He sat down without interrupting and listened to the rest of the chapter with them. When Emily closed the book, Eleanor looked at him with an expression Richard hadn't seen on his mother since he was a boy. Pride, not the pride she'd always shown carefully about his professional success, aware that pride had always cost her son something in terms of pressure. This was different. This was the pride of watching someone become who he should have been all along. "How are you feeling today?" Richard asked. "Better than yesterday," Eleanor said. "Worse than a year ago." She said it without drama. "But I'm okay." "What do you need?" Eleanor looked at him. "Right now, nothing. I've got your hand, and I've got Emily reading. What more could a woman ask for?" Emily smiled down at the book without looking up. Richard learned things in those weeks that were in no contract and no report anywhere. He learned his mother slept better when someone was in the room, even if they weren't talking. He learned she disliked the smell of a certain disinfectant the nurses used, and that Emily had quietly swapped it out weeks earlier for something gentler. He learned that around 5 in the afternoon, Eleanor had a window of energy that lasted exactly an hour, and that was the time for the conversations that mattered. Emily taught him these things without ever making it feel like a lesson. She mentioned them in passing, in the context of other things, and he stored them away with the attentiveness of someone who has understood that every piece of information about his mother was also a debt he was paying off late. One afternoon, Richard was in the kitchen when Emily came in with a list of medications that needed restocking. "Give it to Patterson," he said. "I already did. I just wanted to mention it because one of them takes 3 days to arrive, and if we order it today, it'll get here before we run out." "How do you know how much is left?" "I check every week." Richard looked at her. "You were doing that before I even got here?" "Yes." "Why?" Emily thought about her answer. "Because running out of a medication in the middle of the night is the kind of problem you can avoid if someone's paying attention." She paused. "And that kind of avoided problem never shows up in any report, because it never happened." Richard nodded. "Emily, I want to talk to you about something." She waited. "There's a foundation I started years ago, focused on health issues. I never developed it the way I should have." He paused. "I've been thinking about changing that, focusing it on early cancer screening access for people without resources." Emily didn't answer right away. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because your mother died because she didn't get to a diagnosis in time," Richard said. "And because you've spent 8 months showing me what it means to do things right with what you have. I want the foundation to do something similar, at a larger scale." "What do you want from me?" "Your opinion. What you think works and what doesn't. What you would have needed when your mother got sick." Emily looked at him for a long moment. "You're asking me to help build this. I'm asking you to tell me the truth about what matters. That's what you've done since the day you got here, and it's the only thing I need." Emily nodded slowly. "I'll think about it. That's enough." That afternoon, Eleanor found the two of them in the living room, going over foundation documents, the coffee gone cold on the table because neither of them had remembered to drink it. She watched them from the doorway of her wheelchair, said nothing, but her expression was the expression of someone seeing something she'd hoped to see for a long time and had stopped being sure she ever would. And that expression was worth more than anything she could have said. Eleanor called Richard one morning in November, not through the intercom by her bed for the nurses, but directly on his phone, the way she used to when he was young and she had something to tell him that couldn't wait. Richard was in his study. He answered on the first ring. "Are you busy?" "No." "What do you need?" "Come." He found his mother sitting in the chair by the window, the morning light coming in directly. Her hands folded in her lap with that particular stillness of people who have decided to say something difficult and are waiting for exactly the right moment. He sat down across from her. "How are you feeling?" "Listen to me," Eleanor said. Richard looked at her. "The doctor spoke with me yesterday, alone." She paused. "Things aren't going to get better, Richard." They both already knew it, even though neither of them had said it out loud. Richard didn't respond. "What's left is time. I don't know how much. Nobody knows for sure. But what I do know is how I want that time to look." "Mum, let me finish." He fell silent. "I want you present. Not organized, not coordinated, not informed. Present in this room, in this conversation, in this moment." Her eyes held his with the same directness they always had, one the illness had never managed to take from her. "Can you do that?" "Yes." "Don't answer fast. Think about it." Richard thought about it. He thought about the pending contracts, the partners waiting on decisions, the enormous machine that was his professional life, which kept turning whether he was there or not. And he thought about his mother, 80 years old, with time now measured, watching him from the chair by the window. "Yes," he said again. "I can do that." Eleanor nodded. "There's one more thing." "Tell me." "Emily." Richard waited. "That girl has given more than she should have had to, and she's never asked for anything. When I'm gone, I don't want her to disappear from your life the way staff disappear when a contract ends." "She's not going to disappear." "How do you know?" "Because I'm going to make sure she doesn't." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, with her particular way of checking whether words carried real weight or were just words. She must have found something convincing, because she nodded slowly. "Good." Richard stood to leave, and she stopped him with a single word. "Richard." He turned around. "I'm proud of who you are now," Eleanor said, "not of what you built, of who you are now, here, in this room." Richard didn't answer, because some sentences don't need one. He crossed to her, knelt beside the chair and hugged her with the care of someone holding something fragile and precious. Eleanor rested her hand on his head, the way she used to when he was a boy. They stayed like that for a while. Outside, the garden was full of the cold November light, and the birds made their usual noise, completely indifferent to what was happening inside. Emily found Richard in the garden that afternoon. He was sitting on the stone bench by the fountain, staring at nothing in particular, cold coffee in hand. Emily recognized that posture, the posture of someone who has just had a conversation that needs time to settle. She sat down on the other bench without saying anything. Several minutes passed in silence. "She talked to you," Emily said finally. It wasn't a question. Yes. How is she? Calm, Richard said. Calmer than I am. Emily nodded. Eleanor's been making peace with things for weeks now. It's a process she started on her own before you got here. What changed when you started showing up is that she doesn't have to do it completely alone anymore. Richard looked at her. How do you handle it, knowing she's leaving after everything you've given? Emily thought about her answer with her usual honesty. I don't handle it completely, she said. There are hard moments, but I learned with my mother that the pain of losing someone doesn't go away if you keep your distance. It just gets postponed and it grows. It's better to stay close even if it hurts. Distance doesn't protect you from anything. It just protects you from feeling. And feeling is the only thing that gives being present any meaning. Richard looked at the fountain. My whole life has been distance, he said. I thought it was efficiency. It looked like it, from the outside and from the inside. Emily looked at him. From the inside it looked like a man who'd learned not to need anything, so he'd never risk losing it. Richard didn't respond. It was the most exact description anyone had ever given him of himself, and it came from a 28-year-old woman who'd been in his house for 8 months and had seen him more clearly than everyone who'd known him his whole life. The foundation, he said. I want you to run it. Emily looked at him. We already talked about this. We talked about you collaborating. Now I'm asking you to run it. Build the program, decide how it works. Do it with the same attention you bring to everything else. Richard, I don't have any background in running a foundation. You have something better. You know what's missing, because you lived it. He paused. The training you can get. What you have, you can't teach. Emily was quiet for a moment. I'll think about it seriously, she said. That's all I'm asking. They stayed in the garden until the afternoon chill drove them inside. And neither of them talked about what was growing between them, slowly and still without a name, because there were more important things happening in that moment, and because things that grow slowly don't need to be named to be real. Eleanor Whitfield died on a Thursday in December before dawn. It wasn't dramatic. Richard was in the chair beside her bed, Emily in the other. The nurses had been there until midnight, and then the two of them had stayed alone, because Eleanor had asked for that the night before, with the calm clarity of someone who knows exactly what she wants for the most important moment. She breathed slowly for hours. Richard held her hand. Emily read quietly out loud, not necessarily so Eleanor could hear, but because the sound of the words filled the room with something alive, while the sick woman's breathing grew more and more spaced out. At some point, between 4 and 5 in the morning, the breathing simply stopped. No sudden struggle, no visible pain, just the stillness of something that had decided it was enough. Richard didn't call anyone right away. He stayed there, holding his mother's hand, for a length of time he didn't measure. Emily closed the book. Neither of them spoke. Outside, dawn was just beginning to break, very slowly. When Richard finally stood to call the doctor, he stopped in the doorway and looked back at the room. Emily's flowers in the glass jar, the book on the nightstand, the small lamp they'd left on all night. Thank you, he said without turning around. Emily didn't answer right away. I stayed with her, she said finally. That's what matters. Richard walked out into the hallway and let himself cry, alone, standing against the wall, with the quiet of the house around him, and the particular weight of someone who has lost something, and at the same time knows that the last several months had been a gift he never expected to receive. 3 months after Eleanor's death, the foundation launched its first mobile clinics. Emily had spent those 3 months building the program with the same attentiveness she brought to everything. She'd talked to doctors, social workers, families who'd lost someone to a late diagnosis. She designed a model that didn't rely on people making it to hospitals. Instead, the hospitals would come to the people. Richard signed off on the funding and made the financial decisions. Emily built what that funding was meant to support. It was a partnership that worked because each of them did what they knew how to do. The first mobile clinic pulled out on a Tuesday morning, headed toward 3 neighborhoods where early cancer screenings had never reached. Richard and Emily were there for the launch. They watched the vehicle drive off down the street with the foundation's logo on the side. The name they'd chosen was simple: Eleanor. No last name, no corporate branding. Just Eleanor. "Do you think it's right?" Richard asked. "The name, all of it." Emily looked at him. "I think it's the beginning of something that should have existed before," she said. "And I think the fact that it didn't exist before, and now it does, is what matters." Richard nodded. Neither of them said anything else for a moment. The vehicle had already disappeared around the corner, but they kept looking in that direction, the way you look at something you know is going to keep going, even after you can't see it anymore. "My mother would have said you got here late," Richard said. "And what do you say?" Richard thought about his answer with the honesty he'd learned in a small room at 4 in the morning. "That I got here." Emily looked at him, and in that look was everything neither of them had said out loud yet, and that didn't need saying either, that Tuesday morning, in front of a mobile clinic, carrying the name of a woman who had taught 2 people, each in their own way, that the time you have is exactly the time you decide to use. The foundation grew faster than either of them had calculated. Not because Richard had invested more than planned, though he had, but because the idea was right. In the specific way ideas are right when they respond to something real that nobody had solved yet. The mobile clinics reached neighborhoods where people had no transportation to get to a hospital, or no time because time was money when you got paid by the day, or no trust, because the system had failed them enough times that the distrust was reasonable. Emily had built the model with that reality at its center. These weren't clinics waiting for patients to show up. They were clinics that went looking for them, staffed by people who spoke the right language. Not the clinical language that excludes, but the language of people who know they're talking to someone who actually understands them. Richard learned this on a visit to the 3rd clinic, a month after launch. Emily had brought him along without fully telling him what he was going to see. She'd just told him to come. They drove out to a neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, where the houses had the particular look of places where people build with what they have and wait to have more before they keep going. The mobile clinic was parked on the community soccer field, the biggest open space in the neighborhood, and there was a line of people waiting with the patience of people who've learned that waiting is part of the process, but that on that particular morning the wait was worth it. Richard stood outside watching. He saw a woman in her 50s walk into the vehicle with the tense expression of someone afraid of what she might hear, and walk out 20 minutes later with a piece of paper in her hand and a different look on her face. Not relieved exactly, but holding something, information. The difference between knowing and not knowing, which is the difference between being able to act and not being able to. He saw a young man who'd brought his mother, waiting outside with his arms crossed, eyes fixed on the vehicle with the specific concentration of a son who doesn't know how to pray, but is, in that moment, doing something close to it. He saw the doctor Emily had hired step out to talk to the people in line, not to rush the process, but so the waiting time would be useful too, explaining what was going to happen inside, answering questions, making the unknown feel less threatening. Emily stood beside him. "See the woman in the green dress?" she said quietly. Richard found her, an older woman alone, with a canvas tote bag in her lap. She walked here from 3 neighborhoods over. Took her 40 minutes. Why didn't anyone tell her we could go pick her up? She didn't have a phone to call. A neighbor told her about it, and she came. Emily paused. That's what it means for this clinic to exist. That someone walks 40 minutes because she knows that at the end of that walk, there's something that might change what happens to her. Richard looked at her. How many are there like her? A lot. That's why we need more vehicles. How many more? Depends how far you want to reach. Richard looked at the line. What would it cost to double the operation? Emily pulled out her notebook. She always had the numbers because she'd learned that ideas and numbers are just ideas, and ideas with numbers are plans. She handed it to him. Richard looked it over. Approved. Emily looked at him. You don't have to decide that today. I already decided, Emily. We need to plan it properly. It's not just money. It's staffing. It's logistics. I know it's not just money, he said. That's why you're the one who plans it, and I'm the one who funds it. He paused. How much time do you need, Emily? She thought about it. 3 months to do it right. 3 months. They kept watching the clinic. The woman in the green dress stepped into the vehicle. The young man kept his eyes fixed on the door. "Do you think about your mother a lot?" Richard asked. "Every day," Emily said, "but differently than before. Before I thought about what I lost. Now I think about what she taught me, without knowing she was teaching me." She looked at the vehicle. "That being present is the most valuable thing you can give someone. It can't be bought, it can't be delegated, it can't be scheduled." She paused. "And when you have the chance to be present for someone, you take it, because that time doesn't come back." Richard nodded. The woman in the green dress stepped out of the vehicle with her paper in hand. She talked for a moment with the doctor, nodded a few times and started back toward the road she'd come from, 40 minutes ahead of her, and the difference between knowing and not knowing tucked safely inside her canvas bag. The 1-year anniversary of Eleanor's death fell on a Thursday in December. Richard went to the cemetery alone in the morning. He brought market flowers, not florist flowers, because he'd learned that market flowers are the ones someone picks because they're pretty, not because they're on a list. He stood by the grave for a while. He didn't speak out loud. He wasn't the type to talk at a cemetery, but he stayed present, which was exactly what his mother had asked of him and exactly what he'd learned to do. That afternoon, he went to the foundation. Emily was in the small office they'd set up near the estate, with white-painted walls and a plant in every window, because Emily put a plant in every window of every place she spent time. She was reviewing the clinic reports with the concentration of someone doing that work because it matters to her, not because someone told her to. She looked up when Richard walked in. "How was it?" "Good," he said. "Quiet." Emily nodded. Richard looked around the office. The plants, the reports stacked neatly on the table, the bulletin board on the wall where Emily had pinned photographs of families who'd come through the clinics, not to put them on display, but to remember that behind every number in the reports there was a person. There was one photo in the center that Richard recognized. It was of Eleanor, one Emily had taken 6 months before she died, on an afternoon when Eleanor was in good spirits and the sun was coming through the window at just the right angle. She was looking at the camera with that peaceful expression she'd worn in her final months, the expression of someone who has found a way to be at peace with what is. "Why did you put it there?" Richard asked. "Because it's the reason this exists," Emily said. "And because I think reasons deserve to be visible." Richard looked at her. He'd spent a year looking at her, not the way he had that first day, when she was the employee doing something he didn't understand, but with everything he'd learned over that year layered on top. Her way of walking into a room and knowing what it needed before anyone said a word. Her honesty, which wasn't harshness, but precision. Her ability to be truly present, without any part of her somewhere else. "Emily." She looked at him. "I want to ask you something that has nothing to do with the foundation." "Ask." Richard wasn't the kind of man who went looking for the perfect words. He'd learned that year that the perfect words were often just a way of putting off the real ones. "Can I take you to dinner?" "Not here, not at the house. Somewhere out, wherever you pick, and not a work meeting." Emily looked at him for a moment, not with surprise exactly, but with the honest evaluation of someone who takes her decisions seriously, because she knows decisions have real consequences. "Why do I pick the place?" "Because you've spent a year making better decisions than I have. Seemed reasonable to keep the streak going." Emily let out a short, genuine laugh that Richard had learned to tell apart from her other ones, because it was rare, and that made it worth more. "Saturday," she said. "There's a place near the farmer's market where I used to go with my mother a few times. Simple food. Not the kind of place you're probably used to." "Perfect." "Are you sure, Richard? I spent 53 years going to the kinds of places I'm used to." He paused. "It's about time I went somewhere else." She looked at him, then went back to her reports. "Saturday, 8 o'clock." Richard nodded and headed for the door. "Your mother would be happy," Emily said without looking up from the papers. "Not about the foundation, about you." Richard didn't answer. He walked out onto the street, where the December cold carried that particular end-of-year smell that, in another life, had meant quarterly earnings and projections for the next fiscal cycle. This year it meant something else. It meant 8 o'clock on Saturday, at a restaurant near the farmer's market where a woman had gone with her mother a few times, and which for exactly that reason was the right place to be. On Saturday, Richard arrived 5 minutes early, not to prove he was punctual, but because he'd left with plenty of time to walk from where he'd parked. And walking had given him space to think about the difference between this moment and every similar moment in his old life. In his old life, dinners were instruments. They had objectives. They were measured by what they produced. The person across the table was a variable in a bigger equation. This was different. This was simply dinner with a person he wanted to know better. No equation, no goal beyond being present. It was new, and he'd learned that year that new wasn't scary once you understood that the fear of new things was really the fear of losing control, and that control was often just another word for distance. The restaurant was exactly as Emily had described it. Wooden tables, warm light, the sound of a kitchen working without pretension, the kind of place where the food is good because someone makes it with care, not because someone designed it to impress. Emily arrived on time, in a simple dress, her hair down without the ponytail she wore for work. Richard watched her come in and thought there was something about her that stayed the same in every setting. She didn't change her posture or her expression depending on where she was. She was the same person in Eleanor's room that she was in the foundation office, that she was in that restaurant. That, Richard understood, was what it meant to have real character. They sat down. They ordered without spending too much time on the menu, because Emily knew the place and recommended things with the confidence of someone who knows what's worth it. They talked, not about the foundation, not about work, about other things, about the city where they'd both grown up in different neighborhoods with different lives, that nonetheless turned out to have things in common neither of them had known until that night. About books, about a movie they'd both seen at different points in their lives and had read completely differently, in ways that turned out to be complementary. About their mothers. Emily talked about hers with the particular warmth of someone remembering a person she loved and whose memory no longer hurts the way it did at first. "She taught me to make tamales," she said. "Not the fast way, the long way that takes all day and needs 2 people in the kitchen at the same time, not rushing." "Do you still make them in December?" She paused. "Last year I made them with Eleanor. It was the first time she'd ever made them. She told me it wasn't something her family used to do." Richard looked at her. "I didn't know that." "It was a good afternoon." Emily smiled at the table. She was terrible with the dough, absolutely refused to admit it. Richard laughed. It was a genuine laugh that came out before he could decide whether it was appropriate, and was exactly appropriate for that reason. "She was like you in that," Emily said. "In what?" "When she decided something was true, she didn't budge easily." "Is that a compliment?" "Depends what it's used for. In your mother, it was always a compliment. In you, it's improving." Richard looked at her. There was something in that sentence that was exactly the kind of honesty he'd been receiving from her for a year now, and had learned to value above any other kind of communication. "You think I'm improving?" Emily thought about her answer for real. "I think you're a different person than the man who walked into that room and found something he wasn't expecting to find." She paused. "And I think that difference is real, and it's not for anyone's benefit, because there's no one watching who doesn't already know what you were like before." "You watched." "I watched," she confirmed, "and I can see the difference." They finished dinner without rushing. They ordered dessert because Emily said the flan at that place was the whole reason she'd picked the restaurant, and it turned out to be true. When they walked out, the night had that clean December cold, and the neighborhood streets had the quiet movement of weekend nights. They walked 1 block with no particular direction. "Thank you," Richard said, "for dinner, for the year." He paused. "For being there when I didn't know I needed someone to be." Emily looked at him. "I learned things this year too," she said. "Not just gave them." "What did you learn?" She thought for a moment. "That there are people who need someone to show them the world can work a different way, and that showing them that isn't a sacrifice. It's just doing the right thing, once you know how." Richard nodded. They stopped at the corner where their paths split. "Next Saturday?" Richard asked. Emily looked at him with that honest evaluation that was her way of answering anything that mattered. "Next Saturday," she said, and kept walking. Richard stood at the corner, watching the direction she'd gone for a moment longer. He thought about his mother telling him to learn to love before it was too late. He thought about how he'd arrived late to a lot of things that year, and he thought that late when you finally arrive is better than never. The Eleanor Foundation had, by that month, 6 mobile clinics running and a waiting list for 2 more. Emily had presented the model at a public health conference, and 3 organizations from other states had requested meetings to replicate it. Richard had been at that conference, sitting in the 3rd row, not as the funder introducing the speaker, but as someone who'd come to listen to a person with something important to say. And as Emily spoke to 200 people with the same clarity and the same honesty she'd shown him that very first day in his study, Richard thought about his mother in the wheelchair, telling him that girl was the only person who had treated her like a human being. She had been right, and he'd had the undeserved, unexpected luck of arriving in time to learn the same thing. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the people who show up for us in ways we don't always notice, do me a favor. Drop a comment and tell me what part hit you the hardest. Give this video a like if you want to see more stories like this one, and if you're not subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because there are a lot more stories like Richard and Emily's still to come. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. I'll see you in the next one.